Welcome and thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm Billy Mitchell, editor-in-chief of FedScoop, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Berger, research professor of computer science at Georgetown University. Dr. Berger, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Very well, and thank you for inviting me, Billy.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and would love to jump right into it and ask you about how have agencies around government with missions at the edge been able to leverage private sector research and development investments in emerging technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, and others?
Great. Well, for the most part, the R&D for edge computing has always been done by the private sector. Even if you go back to the 90s and 2000s, the National Science Foundation, military services, and DARPA, funded the research. But it was pretty much done at universities, national labs, and private sector companies. There's no question that the fundamental research has been government funded, but pretty much the market for 5G has arrived. And with the possible exception of the underlying radio access network, the application ecosystem is attracting private capital and investments, and those investments dwarf federal R&D spend. So as a result, the things that we're deploying today, a decade or two after the initial fundamental research, come from the private sector. And likewise, AI has moved from being a laboratory curiosity and handcrafted application-specific implementation to a service that domain experts can train to perform AI-friendly tasks. So there are a number of vendors and systems integrators that can help agencies with AI implementation, as well as commercial packages addressing robotic process automation to improve productivity and the abilities of the agencies to meet an expanding mission without busting the budget. So at this point, agencies can leverage private sector R&D by, at this point, buying and installing product.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for that answer. One of the things we hear a lot about in our space, in the federal space and across government is zero trust. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what role zero trust plays in securing modern tech architectures.
Sure. Well, the foundations for zero trust go back to the 1980s and the 1990s. But wait for it, it became zero trust in 2010. And that's kind of when it started to take off. With that, and especially in the public sector marketplace, even with this long and storied background, it was not until August of 2020 that NIST first published SP 800-207 on the zero trust architecture. Now, the fact that you could argue that the federal standards are kind of new, that doesn't mean that one has to sit back and wait for all of your agency's data to get sucked out or corrupted. Google famously implemented a zero trust architecture in 2009 that enabled them to eat their own dog food to enable workers to access their business applications and development environment from outside the campus. For years, we talk about, in fact, what I characterize as the eggshell defense, hard and brittle on the outside and gooey on the inside. The old concept was put up a firewall and pray, which has three problems. The first is prayer is not sufficient. The second problem being once inside, the attacker is in the candy store. And the third problem, which made me the bane of my CIOs for 2 decades, is if you are a legitimate user and outside the campus, it's a pain to access enterprise applications because of the need to use painfully implemented, unstable, and easily breakable VPNs. As we move more and more to the cloud and students at the high school and college level are more and more cloud native, they'll be like me and ask, why are you making me use this insecure VPN instead of just securing the service? And zero trust architectures give you those tools to secure the service. So as applications truly migrate to the cloud, zero trust is now a given. And I would offer that not architecting or re-architecting for zero trust would not reflect the best practices for agencies.
That's great. So Dr. Berger, we've talked a lot about emerging technologies and emerging processes today. I'd love to hear what emerging technologies do you think are going to have the biggest impact on the government of tomorrow?
Well, the big ones are unquestionably 5G and AI. They're still nascent technologies. We are still exploring their capability to transform the federal enterprise. We are only just beginning to understand the impact that 5G and AI will have in the public sector, but we know it's big. For mission-oriented agencies and components, imagine something like Wi-Fi, but it's reliable and literally everywhere. What missions would that enable? Where could you go? What services could you deliver? For the federal enterprise, think of a world where you need no cables for anything and can move equipment around at will. For that matter, what insights can you unlock when you can connect in real time anything that could collect data? Such vast amounts of data, whether it is cyber intrusion data, anomaly detection, or robotic process automation, it's just too much data for humans to process. Now, couple ubiquitous networking that 5G brings us with AI. Being able to classify events, objects, or other patterns have obvious applications for missions that classify events, objects, or patterns. And so just as on the 5G side, I was kind of talking about new missions, you could argue that these are cost-saving uses of AI to be able to do today's job with less resources and deliver considerably more service tomorrow without having to hire an army of people. Moreover, with the ability to fuse vast resources of data, new kinds of inferences, and thus new kinds of applications and services, we can do much more and deliver much more value in the public sector. This is why 5G and AI are the near-field technologies that will have the biggest impact on the government over the next decade.
That's great. That's a really exciting future to look forward to. Dr. Berger, that's all the time we have, but I appreciate your thoughts today, and it was great catching up with you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.